Permítame que me presente en esta ocasión que tengo por primera vez para dirigirme a ustedes, presentando al profesor Potter. Soy el coronel Manuel Casas, destinado aquí en el Instituto de Historia y Cultura Militar. Encantado de estar con ustedes y de que ustedes estén aquí. Muchas gracias. Pues efectivamente, paso a presentar al señor David Potter. Leo rápidamente su currículum. En 1969 se inició en la investigación histórica en Emmanuel College de Cambridge, bajo la dirección de Sir Geoffrey Elton. Tras completar su tesis doctoral sobre las relaciones anglo-francesas en 1973, se trasladó a la Universidad de Kent, donde desempeñó, entre otras funciones, la de director del Centro de Estudios Medievales y de la Edad Moderna. Publicó libros como War and Government in the French Provinces, Picardy, 1470-1560, Renaissance France at War, Armies, Culture and Society, 1480-1560, and Henry VIII, and Francis I, The Final Conflict, 1540-47. Además ha publicado obras sobre la historia de Inglaterra y Francia en los siglos XIV al XVII, aunque su trabajo se ha centrado principalmente en la Francia del siglo XVI. Tras jubilarse como profesor emérito en 2014, ha completado en el transcurso de 10 años una edición de las cartas de Francisco I, recientemente publicadas en línea, y un amplio estudio sobre Antoine de Bourbon, rey de Francia, rey de Navarra, cuya publicación por Droz está prevista para este año. Muchas gracias, señor Potter, cuando quiera.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say to begin with that I'm very grateful for being invited to this conference and for the courtesy of Eduardo in asking me to give this talk in English. I'm quite aware of the paradoxes of the situation in that I'm speaking on the history of France in English to a Spanish audience, which seems quite strange sometimes. Now, to begin with, in one of his letters to His Most Holy Commander Giovanni de' Medici, del Bandiere, in December 1524, the only surviving original letter, by the way, that Francis I wrote in Italian, that was written for him, is an extraordinary fact. 1 out of 5,000 letters. It's the only one in Italian. This is arrangements for the garrison of Rocca di Montese on the road from Milan to Florence. And he dated his letter from El mio felicissimo campo, appresso Pavia. The letter highlights a number of interesting features. Giovanni de' Medici, father of the future Grand Duke of Florence, Cosimo I, as we will hear later in the afternoon, was a key figure in French military strategy, providing crucial Italian infantry and cavalry support and a network of contacts. 2 months later, having set out the winter in his happy camp, Francis was a prisoner and his army destroyed. I mention Giovanni simply as a way of illustrating the many contradictions of military history in this period. In the pages of Machiavelli and Guicciardini, Italy was a hapless victim of gigantic outside forces which exploited the chronic divisions and amateurishness of Italian leaders. Giovanni was famed in his own lifetime and afterwards as an intrepid cavalry commander who inspired extraordinary devotion in his men, but was also a commander of infantry forces who practiced all the latest techniques of combining pike and shot on the battlefield. In his service to Francis I, he was part of a military machine which was itself extraordinarily multinational and diverse, as a number of the contributions to this conference are pointing out. The powers were locked in a struggle which, ostensibly for the vindication of ancestral rights, was fought out on many fronts for predominance and in the full knowledge of economic imperatives and also the implications of the cost of war for political stability. The king's letters to Giovanni are also a way of introducing the kind of source material I want to exploit in this talk. Francis I and Charles V were often talked about in terms of their general objectives, but not so often in terms of what they actually wrote and thought about what they were doing. This is partly what I want to say today. The Battle of Pavia has always been seen as a major turning point, of course, in the French ambition to dominate the peninsula, and as a major blow to the creation of a French Italy, the end of les premières guerres d'Italie, as it's sometimes been called. It was also one more major lesson in the dangers posed by the presence of a monarch on the battlefield. To add to the lessons of Nancy in 1477, Flodden 1513, Mohat's 1526, the obvious cases. Was, though, the Battle of Pavia the crucial turning point? I think we've been told in the last talk that perhaps it was not. From 1494 to 1521, Milan proved to be highly vulnerable to French military operations. French efforts to control at least parts of Italy continued until the 1550s. But French strategy was fundamentally transformed by the failure of the League of Cognac and the catastrophic defeats of Lautrec at Naples in 1528 and St. Paul at Landriano in 1529. The concessions of the Peace of Cambrai and the fall of Florence in 1530, all this cut away significant elements of French diplomatic and military networks in Italy. Florence under Duke Alessandro, and even more so under Cosimo I, was no longer a remotely reliable ally, and indeed emerged as effectively a Habsburg adjunct. Milan, under its last Sforza Duke, was even less reliable after the murder of Francis I's agent Meraviglia in 1532, and under effective Habsburg rule from 1535. The inception of the French occupation of Piedmont in 1536 marked an important change. The strategy of retaining at least a territory from which France could deploy pressure into Italy. The focus of conflict seems to turn away from Italy in the 1540s and 1550s, but only superficially, I think. Great campaigns may have been fought on the frontiers of northern and eastern France in that era, but French preoccupation with Italy remained a major theme through the War of Siena and the 1557 expedition of Duke of Guise to Naples. I think we should also place in the foreground certain key developments in military strategy and tactics, while bearing in mind the distinct problems of source material for French military organisation before the 1530s. Just give you a few examples of how limited is our understanding of the way in which French armies were actually financed. A very limited basis for them in these computations of the French war expenditure, which I've computed. And then, of course, there are not very many state establishments of the army for France before about the middle of the 1530s. We have to rely extraordinarily on estimations of the numbers of troops in French armies based on ambassadors' reports, so on. These are sort of material. Okay, well, having spent the part of the last 10 years working on the project to edit the letters of Francis I, which is now finished and published online, I'm going to ask still the question of why monarchs, Francis I in particular, attached so much importance to Italy. The answer is, of course, complex and one which has generated a great deal of research and controversy, especially in the last generation. But what I want to do today is simply suggest some answers from the king's own writings. Is it possible the king's own voice can emerge from these documents? The first point, grand strategy and diplomacy. By the 1520s, the contest for Italy is obviously enfolded into the confrontation between French and Habsburg power. In one sense, a continuation of the long-lasting struggle between France and Burgundy, but now immeasurably enveloped by the development of Habsburg dynastic power complex. War in Italy becomes one major aspect of the conflict between the King of France and the Emperor Charles V. The nature of this conflict has been explained in many different ways since the 19th century, from the influential book caused by Minier down to the most recent by Guillaume François in 2022 on the effects of Pavia on the Emperor's dream of a universal empire. This is not to mention the remarkable work of my colleague Marie Le Gall, who has more or less dominated the subject of the Battle of Pavia in the past few years. Personal rivalry was involved, of course, dynastic traditions, competitive emulation, quest for imperium, ambivalence about the very notion of empire. Thinking on the latter was quite obviously consolidated by the imperial election of 1519, though there's evidence of earlier disquiet in France before that. Francis seems to have understood clearly that his conflict with the emperor was an inevitable consequence of the latter's election as emperor, and the issue of the investiture by the emperor necessary for the Duchy of Milan. The issue was very clear by the end of 1519 when Francis wrote for his investiture and was turned down. In September 1521, he wrote of the establishment of his enemies in Milan that it cannot in honour and duty be tolerated. On the other hand, in January 1520, Francis wrote about Charles V, to the Comte de Carpi, his ambassador in Rome. His lands are so scattered in various places, far from one another, and of questionable loyalty and a quality that everybody knows, that you will find it difficult to govern and keep them without seeking something else. This is, after, of course, the height of the revolution of the Comunidades de Castilla. Francis began his reign by achieving in battle a degree of predominance in Italy, which rendered him a natural ally for smaller principalities and city-states. But after 1519, ironically, the natural counterbalance to what was increasingly being called a monarchia, or the project of the emperor to be the dominant power. There's no doubt that Francis and his advisors used the accusations that the emperor was aiming at monarchia, either in Italy or in Christendom as a whole, very frequently. This, unsurprisingly, became much more insistent after 1525, when French power was weakened and the threat of Habsburg imperialism arguably greater. In 1526, we find that Francis urging the Venetians, that's the right one, no, to see that the emperor's objectives can easily be understood. The ruin of Italy and the monarchy, universal rule. At the same time, the king's view of his Italian allies became more sour. In March 1528, in a long farewell audience to the imperial ambassador, Francis asserted that he had never aspired to tyranny, nor the usurpation of things which are not reasonably mine, neither the empire nor a monarchy. The king's letters in 1528 to May are particularly revealing. To the Estates of the Empire, he was able to write rather memorably in March that Germany was being impoverished by Italian wars, and that Italy was the mère ribot, a putain, the chief cause of the poverty, misery, and problems that have afflicted noble Germany. Yet he appealed to the less reliable Marquis of Mantua in 1528 for the common good of the League of all Italy. To his mother, the king wrote in his own hand, I'm going to have to mess about with these things because, they got out of order, as they always do. The king wrote in his own hand during the peace negotiations at Cambrai, "You can see, madame, what infidelity we have found in our new allies, for whom the support and the blood of France, the sang de France, has so long been spent for their defence, which removed all doubt about their lack of obligations towards us. The king was particularly irritated by the opposition of his Venetian allies to references in the possible treaty for a common action against the Turks. With the approach of war in 1536, he cranks up again such fears, this time towards the Swiss, that the emperor, increasing daily his lust for domination, tries in every way he can to ruin our kingdom by malevolent lies and separate us from our allies, so as to overrun them one after the other, so he can thus attain the monarchy he so vehemently desires and pursues. This, by the way, didn't necessarily mean anything like the monarchia universalis that Mercorino Gattinara, the emperor's grand chancellor, is supposed to have advocated. Especially after 1530, Charles V's empire remained a firmly multipolar, composite dynastic state. Nevertheless, Saint-Maurice, the imperial ambassador in France, suggested in 1545 that French leaders stirred up their people with warnings of Habsburg monarchia when they were in dispute with the emperor. Though peace offers were sometimes propaganda devices, as the offers under Clement VII in December 1523 to negotiate a truce, money was in short supply. This is a moment Francis was short of money, and he was being lampooned by pasquils distributed in the streets of Paris and farces. On the other hand, there's reason to believe that Francis could entertain genuine ideas of reconciliation and settlement. In November 1526, on the point of reactivating his alliances in Italy, he wrote in his own hand to the emperor, there we go. Please consider how necessary universal peace in Christendom now is. So desolate, ruined, and afflicted it is now by the wars and conflicts hitherto between us, and innumerable and infinite evils and human blood will be spilt if we do not make peace. This sort of rhetoric was adapted well to moments at which peace seemed the only way out of insoluble military dilemmas. After all, we're living through exactly the same circumstances as far as President Trump and Ukraine is concerned. The other major determinant for Francis was his rooted consciousness of hereditary right. He'd been persuaded to conclude the Peace of Cambrai in 1529 as the best hope of recovering his children for captivity. By 1532, though, the mask had dropped. And in a letter to Clement VII, he talks about the evident wrong that's done to me heretofore to force me to conclude what I could not concede, the hereditary rights to Milan and Naples, and what by right belongs to me and my children, who in time, though I might not be able to take up the quarrel during my life, they will not leave things as they are, but will perhaps resent the violence that has been done to me. There was always a tension between concessions made for purposes of treaty negotiations and what could be regarded as inalienable right, not susceptible to temporary agreements. Well, so much for rhetoric. Next, the king's view of his own role in the Italian wars. How closely can we assess the king's views of his military role through all these different upheavals? There was obviously a tension between chivalric impulses of Francis and practical prejudice. Until 1525, Francis marked his personal involvement in the Italian wars by important war bulletins, often addressed to his mother for wider distribution, which convey a degree of his own imaginary understanding of war. His military bulletin after the Battle of Marignano was sent to his mother, marked by a personal style, as well as deploying all the traditional rhetoric of war inherited from the 15th century world of the Jouvencin du Pays. Marignano, though a decisive victory, was described by an eyewitness as la plus aigre bataille que je crois fut jamais combattue en la chrétienté. And the French casualties, especially among the nobility, were very high. For Francis, in the bulletin he dictated after the battle, his tone is triumphant. At the end of the first day of the battle, remember it was a 2-day battle, the king described himself as so well accompanied by some gentle gallants who defied 4,000 Swiss, forcing them to cast aside their pikes and cry, France! But later, the night was so dark that when it came to cry, France, I assure you that 500 or 600 pikes attacked and showed they were not our friends. One of his famous letters to his mother after the Battle of Pavia is the 1515 bulletin is very detailed and convoluted. 1515 letter is really a very, very different kettle of fish. It's this famous letter to Louise de Savoie. Such chivalric discourse would seem to indicate that Francis I was to a degree deluded by dreams of chivalric glory in his own propaganda. Such, I think, was not the case. The next moment I'd like to consider is the summer of 1523, and I want to say a few words about this in detail. Francis was at the time apparently determined to re-enter Italy and reverse the loss of Milan that he had suffered in 1522. In this light, his correspondence prepares the ground thoroughly, and he sends a long letter missive to the Pope, setting out his claims, very much based on historical precedent. He's writing also to the Swiss cantons about details of their pensions, to Montmorency to assure the passage of the Swiss troops under the terms of the treaty, to discourage the Republic of Venice from negotiating with the Emperor in England, to negotiate with the Duke of Ferrara to tell him that Francis had taken risks for him in Milan by not acceding to Louis X's demands, and also cultivate Guido Rangoni, Leonardo da Carpi, Teodoro Trivulzio, in other words, to cultivate a wide range of support in anticipation of the coming campaign. On all matters he writes, and in fact the final decision I've taken for my journey to Italy and the date I expect to be there with my armies. At these moments, ill health had a knack of cropping up for Francis. On the point of departure, with the route planned and the main force at the Pavie, the king has taken a purge, presumably an enema, and was suffering from a pain in the leg. These sorts of phenomena tended to crop up fairly regularly. All this was about a week before the explosion of the Bourbon crisis and the collapse of the king's plans. By the 17th of September, the lanzknechts had been countermanded and the heavy cavalry as well. So he claimed still to be eager to depart as soon as possible, for I will never have peace of mind until I've joined you and my army. The king also needed very extensive letters, which we could call in these days propaganda letters, to cultivate the goodwill of his subjects. This was absolutely essential for any kind of war policy. And we have some very long letters of announcing the king's policies and essentially arguing that the war in Italy is necessary for the safety of the kingdom, because otherwise the kingdom itself will be attacked, which in fact happens subsequently. Then there are the further war bulletins that he wrote in 1524 on the point of opening his campaign, and with these sorts of terms. From what I can see, the people of this duchy, Milan, Guelphs or Ghibellines, show a true devotion to see the French among them. In Milan, generally, they show great joy at my arrival, as much as they were in Paris. The game has truly changed, and I must so say it shows that God is on our side. There are several very long surviving bulletins of the king's campaigns written for distribution at home along those lines. There was a degree of overconfidence in Francis I's view of war, of course. In a subsequent letter to his mother, late October, he asserted that if she ensured the payment of the troops, not only the state of Milan, but the greater part of Italy is ours, because of the favour God has shown us so far, and I shall achieve the most noble journey ever done, such that God will bring not only the peace of the kingdom that I have so desired, but also the universal peace of Christendom. But here was the thing. The king owed all his soldiers money, though they were so well disposed that they would willingly give him money, he says. They told me that they would be willing to follow me to the ends of the earth. On the other hand, the angular vision created by Andrea Caccia, the papal envoy to the king's camp, written a couple of days after the Battle of Pavia, indicates a very different story. Caccia deploys a picture of a credulous king who entrusted his strategy to a figure, Bonnivet, who was not up to the job, was systematically cheated by mercenaries he employed, sat up all night talking, and got up late in the morning. This was a sort of very, a view of a very deplorable king's routine. Though there may be arguments over the extent of the king's autonomy in taking decisions on peace and war, especially in the light of his sister's assertion that he took the decision to intervene in Italy in 1524 contre l'opinion de chacun, tant d'hommes de guerre que du conseil. It remains the case that such decisions were quintessentially ones that were in principle reserved for the king. The shattering defeat of 1525, battering received by the king in Spain, psychologically, the collapse of his physical and psychological health between October and November 1525, shown by the reports of Andrea Navagero, the Venetian ambassador, and the letters written to Jean de Selle during the king's illness, relates to the work I've done on the extraordinary sequence of autograph letters to the emperor. This, by the way, is a letter from the king's secretary to Jean de Selle in November 1525, saying the king's too ill to sign the letter, and this is why he's written to himself. He's just trying to take the king's ideas from him. How did the king look back on all this experience? To the assembled envoys of the League of Cognac in March 1529, he declared his devotion to them, and that it was such that I was content to abandon my kingdom, but that his need for subsidies was so great in order not to fall into a new difficulty, nor make another shameful journey to me and my subjects. Curiously, this was one of the few retrospective references recorded from the king about his experiences of 1525, another shameful journey. Finally, I want to ask how the king himself developed in his views and objectives, and how he responded to these new pressures. It's well known, of course, that the king rarely appeared at the head of his armies after 1525. Health and temperament were a major explanation. In 1536, he remained on the defensive in a military camp near Avignon, and in 1537 showed himself deeply reluctant even to cross the Alps into Piedmont. Faced with the prospect of crossing the Alps again in November 1537, he began to drag his feet, but then had an access of energy. He wrote a letter, rather unusual letter from Grenoble, when he claimed that he outstripped his companions in climbing the hills. Thanks be to God, I never for 10 years felt better health than I do now, so that a couple of days ago I climbed and descended Montfleur mountain, which is quite a distance from here, which Nancy could not do by mule, no matter how fast he claims to move. Within days, though, he fell ill and started to speak more carefully about joining the army on the way to Piedmont, and began to use even slightly mystical terms. He declared that to arrive in person at my camp is the last remedy and hope. And I want to drink from the chalice and take my part in whatever good or ill befalls. He soon found an excuse not to join the campaign, essentially claiming that without the money needed to pay the troops, that would not be honest or reasonable. A few days later, the king was still feeling the strain. Since I've been here, I realise the air is not good for me and I've fallen ill. Last night I passed 10 or 12 stools. Nevertheless, the king found time to approve one of the routine war atrocities of the age, quite normal for the conventions of war, at the siege of Vigliano. I've heard how the castle of Vigliano was taken and how everyone was butchered, except the captain and some others who were hanged. I heard all this with pleasure, as I agree with you that it will deter the enemy from further resistance in the light of this example. It's been revealed, I think, that the king was increasingly ill in his later years and used his health to avoid audiences with ambassadors, but also deploying himself onto the battlefield. He suffered from a range of ailments, including repeated bouts of tertian fever, as it's called, which I'm guessing was probably malaria, which he had picked up at some stage in Italy. The same is the case with military action. The king's one late appearance on the battlefield in his later years, the strange standoff with the emperor at Machiavelli and Landgressier in November 1543, much trumpeted by rival printed accounts. Both sides tried to gain the propaganda victory over that, in which the French and the Habsburgs accused each other of cowardice, simply pointing out the reluctance of both sides to risk a full-scale battle. And in that sense, perhaps Pavia had done its work. Thank you.